Do you have a brand new Vault Professional installed? Are you migrating from Vault Basic to Vault Professional? Did you see my previous videos and think this guy sounds funny? Let's watch more of him. Well, join me as we configure workflows and revisions within Vault Professional and get them to fit your unique workflow. And as always, like, follow, and subscribe to get more content like this. Today, we're going to configure Lifecycles first, and then move on to revisions and see how they all work together. So if you're configuring Lifecycles, the first thing you want to do is make sure that you are an administrator in your environment. And once you have those permissions, you're going to go to Tools, Administration, Vault Settings. And this will bring up the list of all the Vault settings you can change within Vault. We're going to go to Behaviors and then Lifecycles is where we'll start. Now, Lifecycles are one of the benefits of Vault Professional because it allows you to configure your workflow to match what your current workflow is. At the same time, you can use that to tweak it and match the workflow that you're wishing to use as opposed to the workflow that you're using now. So it really is a good opportunity either to pivot or reinforce the workflow that you're using. For a lifecycle, you can either start from a workflow that was previously configured in Vault. So the ones that you see on your screen are out of the box. Or you can choose to start completely on a blank slate. That depends again on the workflow that you're planning to configure. Today, we're going to start from the flexible release process, which is one of the more complex workflows inside of Vault Professional that comes out of the box. So what we're going to do is edit it if we want to make changes to it, or if we want to use it as a starting point, we would go ahead and say copy. Today, we're going to go ahead and say copy, and that brings up the configuration window for your workflow. First thing you want to do is give it a name. So today we're going to say this is Jose Engineering workflow. And you want to make sure that you give it a name that makes it easily distinguishable between other workflows that you may have in there, as well as makes it easy for your users to understand what it's meant to do. Other examples of that are engineering versus marketing versus shipping, things like that. These different workflows could exist within your Vault, so you can create one for each one of them. On that note, you can also associate what category this workflow will apply to. So by default, it applied it to engineering, which is what we want. If it goes to apply to other work or other categories, we can go ahead and select them from the drop-down list here as well. And then finally, on this first part of the configuration, you want to make sure that you're defining the type of security. Now, you click on this drop-down menu, you'll see there's two options. You have combine and override. Combine just means that if there are permissions being applied by the folders, this workflow will work hand in hand with it to make sure it gives you a good mesh of both permission sets. On the other hand, if you want this workflow to be all be all for your files, you can choose override, and that will make sure that whatever permissions this workflow is applying will trump any other permissions that folders may be applying or users may be applying. So depending on how you want this workflow to behave, make sure that you pick the right option. Typically, we're okay picking combined just because it works, again, hand in hand with other permissions you may have. The first thing you want to, after you've selected all of this, you want to make sure that the states of your workflow are all configured. So you'll see here that we have 5 states that we started off with. If we have additional states, additional review states, additional obsolete states, things like that, you want to make sure that they exist here. The reason I start with this is because all of these states kind of capture the different stages an engineering document can go through. from work in progress to review, released. Quick change is typically one that I have to explain because in some cases you release design documentation, and if it needs to be changed, but the change is not affecting form, fit, or function, you want to make sure that you have a way to edit that and not change the revision. And then revisions we'll touch on a little bit later today, but quick change helps with that. You can go ahead and make these edits, put it back into release without it having to go through the whole release cycle again. And then finally, obsolete. Again, if something is out of production or is no longer being used, you want to make sure that you're able to tell your users and anybody that's consuming this information that that part number of that drawing is no longer being used. So for each one of these states, if you do need to add a new state, you can go ahead and click this this green plus sign here, and it'll allow you to create a new state. You'll be able to give it a name, choose a color for it, which is more for visual purposes. At a quick glance, you're able to see, green means work in progress, so you're able to see it immediately. And then finally, state description. So while it's in this state, what is the purpose of it? It's a good way to explain it to new users and make sure that they're aware of, this workflow and what it's supposed to do and what they're meant to do in those states. Next, we're going to touch on transitions. In my opinion, transitions is the place where you'll spend most of your time configuring. The reason for this is because transitions exist from every state that you've created to every other state that you've created. So you'll see here, there's two sets of transitions. The difference is between where they're coming from and where they're going, and you can tell that by the arrow that you see here. So you'll see here the first half say work in progress to another state, while the other half say from the other states to work in progress. What I like to do is pick one half and make sure that I'm touching every single transition moving forward in that half, right? If you do that, you'll be sure to touch on every single transition available, and you'll be able to know that you've configured every single transition. Why is this important? It's because your workflow in-house probably isn't a spider web going out where every single state can go to every single state. A prime example of that is from work in progress to release. A lot of the times a review state is required. So what you want to do is make sure that users can't go from work in progress to release. And we'll take a look at how to do that in a little bit here. But if you're creating this lifecycle for the first time, you'll notice that everything is in blue. There are certain settings that won't let me change until we've saved the workflow. So what I'm going to do here is hit apply. It'll go through and save my workflow for the first time. Everything turns black, which means I'm able to make changes. One of those settings that it won't let you change is the actual transitions. So now that I've saved it, I can hit edit, and I'm going to start here with work in progress to released, because that's the one we were talking about. We hit edit. We have a lot of information we can configure for each transition. So this is again why I mentioned it'll probably be the one that takes you the longest to configure. It's because not only do you have every single transition created, but for every transition, there is a multitude of settings that you can set for them as well. So the first one is criteria. So in order for this transition to happen, what needs to be true? By default here, you'll see that property compliance is compliant is selected. You can do this for every single property in files. So you'll see here, if you're tracking any information such as description, if you're tracking anything such as part numbers, things like that, you can select those properties, so description, and then set a condition for it. So one of the things you can do here is, if it contains a certain value, if it's not empty, things like that, you want to make sure that you're discussing with your team to make sure that everyone's on the same page, but B, it's standardized across your whole workflow. So you can go ahead and set those criteria here during each transition. A quick way to check for these properties or these conditions is by doing compliancy, which is what you're seeing here. When it's looking for property compliance, it's looking at your properties overall, and it's looking at the conditions that you've set in place. For each property, some of the conditions you can set in place are, is it from a pick list? So is there a set value that it has to pick from? Does it have a value overall? Is it empty? If it's empty and it requires a value, then it'll mark it as non-compliant. If it's supposed to be from a pick list and it's a value that it's not expecting, it'll also mark it as non-compliant. When these little red flags go up, Vault notices it and it marks the file overall as non-compliant. So if you were to set this condition, or this criteria, try to move it forward in your workflow, it would stop you. And that's what you want, right? A lot of the benefits from this workflow is making sure that your information is consistent and consumable. So you want to make sure that when it gets to these release states, the information is all there for whoever's trying to use it. So this can be as complicated as you want it to be or as simple as you want it to be. You just want to make sure that it's consistent and it gets you the information that you want. The next tab over here that we have is actions. Now the original list that we'll have will be set to all, but this list is pretty daunting. So if you want to narrow it down to the type of item that we'll be controlling, we can select files, and it'll give us a more concise list that we can pick from. Now, again, this tab, this option that we have for each transition will have the same options as you move forward. So some of the main ones that we want to look at are bump primary revision. So again, we'll touch more on the actual revisions in a little bit here, but one of the things that workflows can do for you in Vault is actually automatically track your revision for you, which means when a file goes from released to work in progress, it can automatically bump that revision to the next one, whether it's numerical or alphabetic. So in order to do that, you would set the transition that you're looking for and make sure that you enable by clicking that check mark there and tell it to bump the primary revision. Now, there are some instances where a step in your workflow will bump a primary revision, like we just talked about, a secondary revision, or a tertiary revision. Vault is able to do all of those for you throughout your workflow. You just have to tell it where. So instead of going from work in progress to released, you might be going from review back into work in progress. And in your workflow, that might trigger a secondary revision. In order to set that up, instead of just enabling it like we did for primary revision, you want to go ahead and click on this drop-down menu here and select the revision type that you want to happen. So here you'll see if I wanted to go secondary revision, we select that and then enable it. And that will guarantee that we're able to automatically track these revisions again. Another thing you can do in here is synchronize properties, which means if you are changing certain properties, such as who signed off on the drawing, who made the final approval, you want to make sure that those properties all stay consistent as you move forward. So you can do this by enabling this option here, and that'll send it to the job server, which is again a functionality of Vault Professional. It requires additional setup, but you're able to kind of do all these things automatically. And then two of the big options I think as well here are checking that dependent files are released or obsolete. So if you're in a workflow that is working in Inventor and you have an assembly and you want to make sure that all of the parts are either being released or have been released or are released, right? You can go ahead and enable this option. And as it goes through, it checks to make sure that that's true. Same thing with obsolete. you want to make sure that you're not releasing new designs with obsolete parts. Sometimes we lose track of it. Sometimes we think we've replaced those parts, but Vault is here to double check that for you and make sure that moving forward, that does not happen. And then finally, purge. We'll see later on in this workflow, there's actually options to pick what versions are purgeable. So it's able to clean up your versions for you. We'll talk a little bit about that more, but you can set that to automatically happen on state transitions. Next, we have custom job types. So this is less out of the box. This is more for automation. So let's say you have your own custom add-in or your custom PDF generator. You can trigger those jobs from Vault by adding them to, again, this specific transition. To do that, you would go ahead and hit add, tell it the name of the job you want to run, and that way every time this transition happens, it sends that transition or that custom job to your job processor. Again, additional functionality, but if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. The next tab, we have security. Now, this one's, I would say, as important, if not the most important option within your transitions. And the reason I say this is because it dictates who can and cannot make this specific transition. So from work in progress to released, I know we've been configuring it as we go, but in your workflow, if it's not something that's allowed, then we will have to make sure that we block it off. So to do this, we want to make sure that this checkmark down here is turned off, because that enables us to add restrictions to our workflow. Go ahead and add, because we want to make sure that we're adding the right groups or people to this list. Now, the easiest way to make sure that nobody can do it is by adding the group of everyone, hitting OK, and then you'll see that there's an option to either allow this group to do it or deny this group to do it. So by clicking everyone, this includes administrators, and hitting deny, it completely blocks it off. So in your workflow at all times, no matter who you are, if your files are in a work in progress state and you go to change the transition or change the state to a new one, released will never show up for anyone. But that may not be the case, right? So we can go ahead and remove everyone here. Instead, let's say we want to limit it to certain people. So like, let's say administrators are the only ones that are allowed. If I go ahead and add this group and select it as allow, that does not mean that engineers will also get the option just because they're not denied. The list is still exclusive. It basically allows only the people added to it to perform the function. You don't need to add the other groups and say deny. It just will not allow them by default, by omission. So if that's the case, you want to make sure that the right groups are enabled and that option will show up for them. Something to keep in mind here though is if you have users that are both in your administrator group and your engineering group, they will be allowed because they are part of administrators and not on the side of engineering. Denies, on the other hand, are very explicit, so that works the other way. If you have engineering groups in here as deny, even though your users are part of administrators, they will not be allowed to make the transition because their other group has been denied. And then finally, we have peer review. So this is one of the newer functionalities that came with Vault Professional in the past couple of years. Peer review allows configuration so that the same person is not the same one pushing your files or your designs the whole way through. And what I mean by that is you can have it so that one user can send it from work in progress to review, but that same user cannot send it from review into release. And the way that it does this is it checks to see who the last person to make that edit was. or to make that state transition was, and it stops them from being able to make a new state transition moving forward. And this is, again, for specific scenarios. So like I mentioned earlier, the more common transition that you would see this under is from review into release, where you would double check that it's not the same person that sent it from work in progress to review. Now, you can do this for specific file types. So like, let's say you only want this for drawings. What you would do here is you would create a new rule by hitting add, give the rule a name, and now let's say how we want files to be sorted into this specific rule. The easiest way would be to say, well, I know all my drawings are IDWs in my Vault environment. So what we can do is say, look for file extension. The condition is contains, and we want to say IDW. We go ahead and add it. And this means that in the scenario where a file is going from work in progress to released, and it is an IDW, the same person who originally put it into work in progress cannot be the same person to put it into released. Again, more commonly used when going from review into released, but can be set at any point in your workflow. Now, that's a lot. Our recommendation here at KETIV is to make sure that you have your workflow mapped out, including the conditions that you'll have throughout each transition and at each state. This way you have a roadmap where you can follow and make sure that you compare it to as you're configuring and making sure that everything is working the way that you envisioned. And again, you want to make sure that you do this for every single transition. Some of them may be a little shorter, where we're just denying a group from doing that transition at all. Some of them may be a little bit more complicated because you have to figure out who is allowed and who isn't, and kind of sorting through that. So again, you want to make sure that you pick a set of transitions, and then you'll see as you switch between states, that set kind of changes. But overall, if you click the correct set or the same set moving forward, you'll be able to hit every transition. Next, we have security. Now, while transitions are picking and choosing who is able to move from state to state and what those conditions are, security on this page here dictates what the permissions are while it's in the state. So you'll see here, if we go to work in progress, everyone is allowed to do pretty much anything while it's in work in progress. You don't want to tighten security too much while it's in work in progress, because you want to allow your users to make the changes that they need and make the edits as they see fit. One thing you may want to change here is under the delete permission, whether or not you want them to delete files. That would be, again, dependent on your workflow, but you can see there's 3 options you can pick from: allow, deny, and blank. By default, blank is a deny, but it's not explicit, which means, like we talked about earlier with the workflow, if you are in multiple groups and one of them has a blank, all the users in that group would be not allowed to do that certain functionality, whether it be delete, modify, download. But if you're part of 2 groups and the other group has allow, even though one of your groups has a blank, you'll be allowed to do it. Now, when we talked about the workflows, we saw that if a deny is in place, regardless of how many groups you have assigned to you that have that allow permission, that one deny is explicit and it won't let you perform whatever action you've been denied just because you're part of that initial group. So be careful when you use denies. They're explicit, they're very powerful, but they also help you narrow things down and tighten up security as you see fit. Now, this one here, again, we have the everyone group, but if we wanted to diversify the permissions that we have in here, what we can do is remove the original group that's in there, and similar to our workflows, we hit add and add our groups. So in this case, I have administrators, engineering, and read-only. If I hit add here, I can go ahead and select the permissions for each one of those groups, specifically in the state that I'm in. So again, allow, and let's say read-only. In this case, let's say we don't want read-only to be able to see anything that's not in released yet. So specifically, I don't want them to even know it exists. I can go ahead and deny them here, while my engineering group is allowed to read, modify, and download, but not delete. Again, I don't have to explicitly tell them that they can't delete, but by leaving it blank, it will stop them from doing so. It'll just tell them they don't have the permission. A couple of options down here are security for associated files of items. If you're working with items in Vault Professional, then these permissions that you're setting for your workflow can be pushed down from your item to your files in a pretty much in a chain to make sure that, yes, users are not able to do certain things to the items, but as those permissions on the items change, the files controlled by those items are also getting the same permissions. So you can go ahead and do that here. And same thing for folders. If you're putting your folders through a workflow, the files within the folders can also inherit the permissions that you're setting based on the state. And again, you want to make sure that you're going through every single state that you've created and ensure that the security that you've set in each state is what you need it for to match your workflow. Moving forward, we have control. So one of the conditions we saw in our transitions is check if the children are released. Well, how does Vault know whether a file has been released, right? Maybe my release state is called approved or release or whatever matches your workflow. Well, the way that Vault knows is actually by setting this flag. So you'll see here, for every state that you go into, you can set whether or not this is considered a released state. The same thing applies for obsolete. So you'll see here that while it's in release, it has that release flag. The check or the action that you've put in place on that transition will clear, will go through because it's checking for released files. Now, I mentioned earlier, it's checking whether it is released or it's going to be released. Vault is smart enough to know that, hey, I may not be releasing just the assembly. I may be releasing the assembly and its children at the same time. And what it does is it checks to make sure that that's happening, and it still counts it as a success on the check. Beneath these two state flags that we see here, released and obsolete, you have an option of controlled versions. Now, we taught, again, one of the actions that we saw earlier was purging. So getting rid of unnecessary versions created. One of the biggest ones is while in work in progress. So if something is in work in progress, it may go through 3 edits, it may go through 300 edits. Do you want to keep all of the edits that were ever made, or are you okay with just creating a sandwich, what I like to call a sandwich? Do you want to know where the file started and where it ended before it went into review? Then you would use the first and last option. What that does is it protects the first version created in work in progress and the last version created in work in progress before it moves out of the state. What I mean by that is if you create 30 versions of a file in work in progress, you can purge 28 of them, and then it goes into review. Let's say something comes up in review, you send it back into work in progress. It still won't purge the original 2 work in progress versions that you created, it'll start a brand new sandwich. You can create another 30 versions, purge another 28, and you'll keep saving those sets. So that's what first and last does. Released, typically you want on all, you want to make sure that every time a file makes it to your release state, they're all safe, right? You want to make sure that nobody's deleting them by accident, nobody's purging them by accident. So you go ahead and select all. And then similar to first and last, if you don't really care where the file started, you just want to know where that work in progress version ended, you can just save me the last one. All of the other ones are fair game. You can go ahead and select last here. And if there's any that you don't really care about, every single one of them can get deleted. You do have the option here of none, and making sure that those are uncontrolled. You can do with it what you want. Once you select the control that you want over them, just make sure that you select include existing file versions if you want to include any of the ones that have already gone through a workflow. But if you're setting this up for the first time, you can select it or unselect it. It'll keep track of those control settings moving forward. And then finally, we have comments. And these comments are set for when a file or an item go into this state, right? So when it goes from released into work in progress, a comment gets generated and it says, available for editing. If it goes into review, under review, and you have different options that you can set. So it's really, again, what matches your workflow. If there's some of these that don't fit what your workflow is about, you can go ahead and remove those options, or you can go ahead and add new ones to be a more personalized comment as you move through your workflow. For me, I like to keep it pretty standard and keep my workflow pretty open. Any edits that need to happen, just make them on the fly and kind of go through it. And that should be it for workflow. So now that you have your workflow mapped and configured, let's make sure it's tracking your files the way that you want it to in your environment. So let's configure revisions in Vault Professional. So we're going to go ahead and close out of our workflow. And what's nice is it's in the same area of behaviors that we have our life cycles. It's actually right underneath it. So let's go into revisions. Now, there are 3 schemes available right out of the box for Vault Professional. Standard, alphabetic, and numeric are straightforward. Every letter, every number that you can think of, they're there. But you may have to follow an ASME format, which means there's certain values that are omitted. O or Q can't be part of your revision scheme. That's also an option that you have. But you also have the option of being completely different from these options, which Vault luckily allows you to configure that. So let's pick one to start from, and let's say it's ASME, but we're going to make some edits. So what we're going to do again is copy this, give it a good name again. So this is Jose's Engineering Division C. Again, you're going to pick the categories that this applies to. So this one right here is applying to all item categories, but we've been working with files and we've only been working with engineering. So again, this will dictate what it's applying to and what's being tracked. So in this case, our engineering files are being tracked. Now, for every revision scheme, there are 3 parts of it. There is the delimiter, which goes in between your revisions. I mentioned earlier, primary, secondary, and tertiary. If you're not sure what those look like or you don't use them, Vault gives you an example over here of how these schemes are going to look once they go into production. So you'll see here that primary can be a letter, and then you're selecting a secondary and tertiary, which are separated by that delimiter, which in this case it's a period. Most commonly it's a period, but you have the option to pick whether it's a dash, a slash, or any of the options there it really depends, again, on your environment. Now, the other parts that we have here are primary, secondary, and tertiary scheme formats. Now, that means what for each revision type, what is it going to use? And you can go ahead and pick that scheme format in this tab here. So you'll see here that those three primary formats that we talked about are available. And again, you can start from any of them. So if, let's say, your format more closely resembles an ASME format, again, we're going to go ahead and copy this, give it a name, and this gives us the list of values available for our revisions. Now, if your revision scheme matches this letter for letter in all the values, you're in a good spot, right? You don't have to create any. But let's say you have a dash or a NR for not released, and that's where everything starts at. Then you want to make sure that that value exists for all of your files or all of your items. So let's go ahead and add this. So by default, you'll see that A is the revision it starts at. So we want to go ahead and add a value. And again, it really depends on your workflow or your environment. So you're going to select, let's say, NR for not released. Now you'll see here, it again depends on, it depends on the scheme that you're starting off with. So for this one, it's not allowing us to do this. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to go with dash. So if we start off with a dash, go ahead and create it. We can go ahead and move this up on the list so that it goes in the order that we want it to. And then finally, what we want to do is set it as our default. And this means that anytime a file goes or an item goes into this revision scheme for the first time, it will start off at this revision. So it'll start off at dash, which is what we want. And we have the option of restructuring our values here. So again, this revision scheme can be as custom or as simple as you need it to be. And that's one of the benefits of working within Vault Professional. But once we created our format, it becomes available. And what that means is when you come to your primary scheme, you can pick it now from here. Now, if that very same format is used for your secondary and tertiary schemes, you could do that as well. Or if one of your other formats is numeric, you can go ahead and pick that. You can mix and match as necessary, and again, as is needed in your environment. The final section we have here is comments. So that just means that when a file or an item gets assigned this revision scheme, what do you want it to inform the users of? Again, the more information you have in Vault, the more useful these comments are. So you can search through them and find them more easily. So in this case, because I copied it from that ASME format, I can go ahead and remove that and add mine. And, Jose revision scheme will be the comment that gets applied whenever this revision scheme gets used. And we want to do the same thing for our description. Jose revision. Now, we want to make sure that this revision scheme is set up the way that we want it to, because we're using our workflow. As the workflow progresses and it goes through many cycles, you want to make sure that the data on your files or your items is accurate and is following the expected changes that you want. You want to make sure that as you're sending out this information, it's accurate, it's consistent, and it gets to your users the way that you need it to. So revision schemes, although pretty simple and straightforward, play a big part in your workflow and in configuring Vault Professional. But once you have your scheme here, if you want to take one last preview of it, you'll see here, because I changed my primary and secondary format, the dash will now be used for primary. That's where it starts. And then secondary and tertiary will follow suit. So if this, again, I'm like, whoa, I don't really want it to look like that, I can say for my secondary, use alphabetic, and you'll see here the preview updates automatically. So now that you have your workflow and revisions configured, go over to Donnie's video about categories and see how it all fits together in Vault Professional. And remember, like, follow, and subscribe if you want to see more of me and my team talk about Vault Professional.